Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Published later this week is a book that shatters many of the cherished myths of the 1971 war. And because it's published more than 50 years after the war ended, not only will it make headlines, but it's very possible that it could also create considerable controversy. And here is the book. It's called India and the Bangladesh Liberation War, The Definitive Story. And its author is the well-known diplomat Chandrashekhar Dasgupta, and today he's my guest. Mr. Dasgupta, as I said in that introduction, your book shatters many of the cherished myths of 1971, and I want to talk to you about several of them one by one. But first, you write, the records conclusively disprove the story popularized by Field Marshal Manekshaw that he had dissuaded Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in April from sending an unprepared army into East Pakistan. But the truth is that the Prime Minister had already decided against early intervention, and she actually used General Manikshaw, as he was at that time, simply to bolster her decision. I'll come to details later, but am I correct when I put it like that?
Absolutely correct. The Prime Minister had already made up her mind that it would be counterproductive to intervene militarily in what was then East Pakistan till the diplomatic ground had been prepared, and therefore operations should be postponed till the end of the year. Some of her cabinet colleagues, however, were in favor of immediate action, and she therefore used the army chief's advice to carry them with her.
Now, I'll come to some of the details behind her decision not to intervene in April but to wait in a moment's time. But there is a very interesting and I would say non-serious reason which you mention in your book. You write, when the Eastern Command began to draft operational plans in April, it discovered that maps of East Pakistan in its possession were over 50 years old. I know it sounds partly comic, but it's also, I suppose, a bit worrying that the Indian Army had maps that were 50 years old.
It's certainly comic. The reason, I think, is that there were no contingency plans for major operations in East Pakistan. There were only limited contingency plans to address an event a situation where Pakistan might launch an air attack against Kolkata, or threaten the Siliguri corridor, what is called the chicken's neck in North Bengal. So there were only limited plans for this. There was no planning at all for any contingency involving major operations in East Pakistan.
This is very interesting. I'll just underline it before I move on. The Indian Army had not planned for, and therefore I presume had not thought of, any contingency where they may be required to literally, to quote, invade East Pakistan, and therefore they didn't need maps for that purpose. They had contingencies for smaller things, but no real plan for stepping in and invading.
Absolutely, and the Pakistanis were aware of this. When Kissinger passed through Pakistan on his way back from China, he tried to alert Yahya Khan about what he believed were Indian plans to liberate Bangladesh. And Yahya Khan dismissed this. He said, India is not planning this type of war at all. It doesn't, she doesn't consider it in her national interest. Because they were thinking of the situation that prevailed before Pakistan launched the genocide in
This is again very interesting. Not only had India until 1971 no plans or intentions to actually invade in any sense East Pakistan, but East Pakistan authorities, and more importantly West Pakistan authorities, were pretty certain this wasn't going to happen either. Both sides believed that there was no need to step into East Pakistan.
Yes, West Pakistan, the military authorities knew that this was the situation.
Let's then come to the real serious reason why India couldn't go to war in April 1971 and needed to wait a good 8-9 months. This was in fact made very clear by Mrs. Gandhi's principal advisor, P.N. Haksar. He said, and I'm quoting from your book, "We cannot at the present stage contemplate armed intervention at all. It would evoke hostile reactions from all over the world and all the sympathy and support which the Bangladesh cause has been able to evoke in the world will be drowned in an Indo-Pak conflict. In other words, not only were we unprepared ourselves to step in, but it would be counterproductive if we had done so.
Absolutely. Haksar was a brilliant diplomatic analyst, and he repeatedly pointed out to the Prime Minister that since the end of World War II, during the Cold War period, that is to say, the principles of territorial integrity of states and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries were firmly established both in international law and in international practice. There had been no example of a successful secessionist movement since the end of World War II. Haksar had served as High Commissioner in Nigeria, and therefore he had vivid memories of Biafra. But of course, there's also the example before that of the Katanga secessionist movement.
Both of which were put down, but both of which did briefly attract a certain amount of foreign help.
Precisely.
But they were put down, and the world, by and large, stood by the Nigerians and by Lagos.
Precisely.
And that's what Haksar was pointing out.
Precisely. What he emphasized was that if India were to intervene straight away without preparing the diplomatic ground, the international community would cease, any support for Bangladesh would cease to exist.
And that would be totally counterproductive to India's interests.
Totally counterproductive to India's interests.
Now, it was against this background that Mrs. Gandhi sought General Manekshaw's opinion. And this is the point at which the first cherished myth of 71 gets shattered. This is what you write. The Prime Minister asked for the Army Chief, General Sam Manekshaw's opinion, knowing fully well that he would need time to prepare for a major unplanned contingency. Failing to see through the Prime Minister's political ploy, Manekshaw, a gifted raconteur, circulated a colourful tale about how he had restrained Mrs. Gandhi from ordering the Indian Army to march into East Pakistan in April. In other words, the Army Chief, being a good storyteller, manufactured a story or fabricated a story that showed him in a rather good light, but it wasn't the truth at all.
It wasn't the truth. I don't think, we should take Manekshaw to task for failing to see through a political ploy. He was a soldier, not a politician. But he did concoct the story. I think he genuinely believed that it was on the basis of his advice that the Prime Minister decided to delay the war. But he did add color to it.
Absolutely.
By, saying that she was very angry and upset.
But there was a certain, I suppose, gullibility on his part when he began to believe that actually it's on my advice that she didn't go in and she waited 8 months. In fact, that was always her intention.
Precisely.
She was using him to bolster her against members of her own cabinet
Precisely.
who were keen to go in at once.
Precisely. Precisely.
Now, as I said, this is the first myth, and for many people, this is the biggest myth of all, which you have completely shattered and blown apart. But are you aware you're going to probably face a pushback from people who are admirers of Field Marshal Manekshaw, and there are quite a few of them in the army, and you'll certainly face a pushback from people who are critics of Indira Gandhi and don't like the fact that you've given her the real credit?
Well, that could happen, but it would be totally logical. Because my book is not about personalities. It is about national policies. And the point that I emphasize is that it was a national victory. Right at the outset, what I say is, I cite 1971 as an example of what we can achieve when there is an overarching national aim.
Absolutely. And the more important thing is that this is the truth. People may not like it because their favorite myths have been shattered, but the truth is the truth, and you can't say we let the myth prevail at the cost of the truth.
Precisely. And it has to be said to Mrs. Gandhi's credit that she never claimed that this was, her personal doing, that this was a personal victory. When she addressed Parliament on 17th December 1971, announcing the end of the war, she made it she paid tribute to the army, she paid tribute to the millions of Indians who had generously extended help to the
She didn't take the
hapless
credit for
refugees.
herself.
Not at all. And she made it a point to thank opposition parties for their understanding and cooperation.
And if I
during
recall
the war.
correctly, that was the famous occasion, maybe not that particular day, but around that time when Vajpayee called her Durga. And if I recall correctly, The Economist called her Empress of India.
That's right. That's right.
Let's come at this point to the second myth which is shattered in your book. And it's to do with who was the principal architect of the invasion plans. And once again, the world has assumed it was General Manikshaw, as he then was the army chief. But you show very clearly in your book that the actual architect was the Chief of Staff of Eastern Command, Major General J.F.R. Jacob, as he then was. He went on later to become a Lieutenant General, an Army Commander, Eastern Command, but at the time, he was Chief of Staff under General Jagjit Singh Arora, and he was the real architect of the invasion plan.
Right. The initial plan was drawn up by General Jacob. The Army headquarters then worked on it, and more specifically, the Director of Military Operations, General K.K. Singh, drew up a revised plan, drawing largely from Jacob's plan, but departing from it in a major respect, and that is the thrust towards Dhaka, which Jacob advocated, was not there in the Army headquarters plan. And this was the plan that was approved by Manikshaw. However, during the 1971 December operations, the course of events corresponded more closely to Jacob's original plan rather than the Army headquarters plan.
In fact, the truth is it corresponded
Manikshaw.
not just more closely, almost entirely to Jacob's plan, rather than the K.K. Singh plan which Manikshaw had approved. But there's an interesting bit of light that you shed on the whole thing. You point out that the original plan, the K.K. Singh plan which Manikshaw approved, was based on the belief that in fact the war would be ended before an unconditional Pakistani surrender, because the UN Security Council would impose a ceasefire. And therefore, the aim of the original plan was to occupy the major part of Bangladeshi territory and to place the Pakistani forces in an untenable position that would soon compel them to withdraw from the rest of the country. It was General Jacob who in fact insisted that Dhaka was the geopolitical heart of East Pakistan and its capture should be the key objective of army operations. In other words, don't just capture enough territory to force and compel the Pakistanis to withdraw from the rest. You have to go for the jugular, the heart and the core, that's Dhaka, because if you don't, you may not end up winning the war.
That's true. But I think we should bear in mind the fact that these plans were drawn up before the conclusion of the Indo-Soviet Treaty, and long before an assurance was received from the Soviet Union of an unconditional assurance that they would veto any draft resolution in the UN.
That's perfectly true.
close
So
the
the
war.
plan was drawn up before we had an assurance from the Russians that we
That's
will
right.
veto a ceasefire resolution if it's being proposed too early and it doesn't suit you. However, that treaty with the Soviet Union was concluded a good 2 months before war began, and it doesn't seem from your account that the plan was revised after the treaty was concluded. They stuck with the old plan, even though the treaty had made something new not just possible, but necessary.
Absolutely true. There were a number of amendments made to the plan till October on the basis of exercises, etc., that were carried on. But the treaty does not seem to have figured in these calculations. An unconditional Soviet assurance of support in the Security Council was received only on 30th November. And instructions were then issued by the government to the defense forces to liberate the entire territory of Bangladesh.
But in fact, you also shed light in another way on this whole thing. You point out that General Jacob had to personally persuade a lot of people
Yes.
that what he was advocating,
Yes.
the capture of Dhaka rather than just a sizable amount of territory, made sense and was necessary. And it was only the new director of military operations, the man who replaced K.K. Singh, Major General Inder Singh Gill, who concurred with him, and that ensured that Jacob's plan was the plan that worked and would follow.
Well, yes, the new DMO, as you correctly say, General Inder Singh Gill, was persuaded about the validity of Jacob's plan.
So Jacob took it upon himself to persuade a lot of people, and he wasn't a very senior officer. He was only Chief of Staff, Eastern Command, and only a Major General.
Yes, he was.
But he took a personal initiative to persuade people and point out, look, Dhaka is what we have to go for.
Yes.
The plan that you've devised, just capture enough territory and compel the Pakistanis to leave, won't be good enough.
That's true. He did this, and he did this even before the Soviet assurance was received on 30th
Which is
November.
why he is the real architect.
Yes.
Okay. Let's now come to what I call the third of the cherished myths. And again, this is quite a big one that your book shatters. This time it's the belief or the claim that India won the war but lost the peace. And that claim is based upon the belief that India had failed to use the advantage of defeating Pakistan in East Pakistan to settle the Kashmir problem by converting the old ceasefire line into a formal border. And you point out very cogently in your book that that wasn't Indira Gandhi's intention at all. She had two intentions, you say. One was to convert the old ceasefire line into a new line of control and to ensure that it was bilaterally acceptable. And secondly, to set up some sort of bilateral mechanism so that if there were future problems between India and Pakistan, they would be sorted out bilaterally. And on both those, she succeeded in Simla.
Absolutely. And even before Simla, she succeeded in achieving her principal aim during this war, and that was the liberation of Bangladesh. We must remember that the 1971 war, unlike all other Indo-Pakistan wars, was not about Kashmir in the first place. It concerned the Eastern Front, not the Western Front. And India's principal objective was already achieved on 16th December 1971, when the Pakistani army in the East surrendered unconditionally to the Indo-Bangladesh Joint Command. It was only during the December War that India adopted a secondary aim. And the secondary aim was to substitute the old UN-imposed ceasefire line into a new line of control, reflecting ground realities in December 1971. And moreover, to persuade Pakistan to agree that all differences between the two countries should be resolved bilaterally rather than through the United Nations.
Absolutely.
And these aims she achieved in Simla.
In fact, your book points out three reasons why Indira Gandhi realized and understood that she couldn't use Simla to actually convert the ceasefire line into a formal border and use that as a moment to resolve the whole Kashmir problem, because as you say, relinquishing or surrendering India's claims to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir would trigger strong public protests in India fanned by opposition parties. Converting the ceasefire line into a border and thus resolving the Kashmir problem would have meant giving up Indian claims to the whole of POK, and there was no domestic consensus. So those people who claim that Indira Gandhi lost an opportunity to resolve the Kashmir issue failed to realize that actually she'd have created a huge domestic problem if she'd done it.
Absolutely. There was no national consensus on this issue. And therefore, she couldn't really, she was not in a position to agree to converting the line of control into a legal international boundary. Though this was probably her long-term intention, that the line of control would evolve into
the
some
LOC,
sort of a boundary.
converting the ceasefire line into an LOC, which is only a bilateral issue between the two countries, was one step towards that.
Precisely.
Now, you also, in your book, knock on the head a claim that is often made, and I have to admit it's usually made by armed service officers or retired officers, that Indira Gandhi failed to use effectively the leverage she had of keeping in her custody 93,000 Pakistani soldiers. Many people say she could have used this as a bargaining ploy and forced Bhutto to accept the ceasefire line as a border and resolve Kashmir. People forget that she couldn't, because the Geneva Conventions to which India was a signatory specifically prohibited this. She would have once again incurred the wrath of the world if she tried to do this.
Absolutely true. The Geneva Conventions do not allow prolonged incarceration of prisoners of war or using them as a political bargaining counter. And quite apart from violation of international law and the condemnation that would have brought upon us, there's a very material factor. If he had violated the Geneva Conventions, we could not have claimed the protection of these conventions in any future conflict where Indian soldiers might have been taken as prisoners of war.
And by the way, we even needed the protection of the Geneva Conventions in 71 itself, because there were Indian soldiers who were prisoners of war in West Pakistan.
True.
And by the way, there are many Indian Army officers who believe that they are still there, that they haven't been returned. Books have been written on that. But that's another issue.
Yes.
But there is a third reason why Indira Gandhi couldn't do what people think she should have, which is to use Simla to sort out the Kashmir issue. And that is a reason that no one's ever thought of, yet you brought it out for the first time in your book. It's the role of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was extremely supportive of India in the lead up to the war, during the war itself, and ensuring that there were no adverse resolutions passed by the Security Council before India was ready to accept them. But in early 1972, when India approached Moscow for more arms, Moscow's response was prolonged silence. This is what you write. It withheld a positive response to India's new request for arms till after the Simla summit. Clearly, this was a calibrated way of Moscow saying to Delhi, don't make and don't look for unwarranted gains at Simla.
Absolutely. I think that was the message the Soviets were sending to us. Actually, on the eve of the Simla summit, our foreign minister, Sardar Swaran Singh, visited Moscow, and his aim was to persuade the Russians to deliver the arms that we'd asked for. He received a very warm welcome, but he did not get the assurance that he'd sought. And it was only after Simla that the arms started arriving. Incidentally, one of the first things Swaran Singh did on his return from Simla was to brief the Soviet ambassador on what had happened at Simla.
So that the Soviet ambassador in turn could tell Moscow, it's all gone well. They haven't put any pressure on Bhutto and Pakistan in terms of Kashmir. We are now free to give them arms. In other words, our message, sent subtly but pretty effectively, was understood.
Well, yes, but it was never our intention to do what the Soviets feared we might have done.
Except that those who claim that Indira should have don't realize that this was another factor.
Yes, absolutely.
They weren't aware of it, but she was.
Absolutely. And during the December War, we had repeatedly assured the Soviets that we have no territorial ambitions in the West.
Absolutely, which is another reason why they were happy to step in and ensure that nothing happened at the Security Council that was against our interests.
Quite.
Finally, there is the claim that a wily Bhutto got the better of Indira Gandhi at Simla. And here, to be honest, when I read your book, I get the feeling that this is one myth that might end up being at least partly correct. You point out in your book that all the drafts prepared by India for the Simla agreement referred to what you call a joint supervisory body for the new LOC. Pakistan repeatedly deleted that. And subsequently, Abdul Sattar, who then went on to become Pakistan's foreign secretary and later even foreign minister, pointed out, and I'm quoting, by persuading the Indian side to drop this clause, Pakistan checkmated India's move to withdraw the UN military observers group in India and Pakistan. India, we know, believed that particularly after 71, there was no role for UNMOGIP. Pakistan wanted the UN to continue to be present, and on that limited point, Pakistan got its way.
Yes, that was a concession that was made to Pakistan. But the fact that a concession was made does not mean that Bhutto outwitted Indira Gandhi. As you noted earlier yourself, Indira Gandhi achieved her principal aims at Simla. And the fact that a concession was made merely reflects the fact that Simla was not a dictated peace. It was a negotiated agreement, and there was some element of give and take.
And also, it would not have served Indira Gandhi's purposes to have so humiliated Bhutto in Simla that he returned to his own country a humiliated man.
Precisely.
He would have lost his position there.
Precisely.
So it was in our interest to give him something because we wanted him to remain in power and perhaps one day fulfill the belief that the LOC could become, in the fullness of time, a proper border.
Yes. It's not so much that we wanted Bhutto to stay on in power.
But we wanted
rather,
stability.
we didn't want the army, exactly. We wanted a civilian government in Pakistan rather than a return to military
We're
dictatorship.
coming to the end of this interview, and I want to put to you the overwhelming impression left in my mind, and I'm holding it up again as I read this book. And the overwhelming impression is that this was Indira Gandhi's golden moment. She was masterful in her conduct of diplomacy. A lot of Indians were extremely proud when she wrote that letter to Nixon refusing PL 480 just days after we had defeated Pakistan. But she was also sagacious, wise and calm right through the 16 days of war. There were moments when actually the Indian army wasn't doing so well. And this General Manikshaw talked about to me in a BBC interview when he went to her and she reassured him and said, Sam, you can't win every day, don't worry. So the overwhelming impression your book leaves is that this was Indira Gandhi's golden moment. Am I correct in getting that impression?
Absolutely correct. This was her finest hour. As you said earlier, she was hailed as Ma Durga in India. The London Economist had a cover story on her describing her as the Empress of India. She had reached the zenith of her fame. Who was to have guessed at that time? Who could have guessed that in less than 3 years her popularity would reach its nadir?
Absolutely. Those are the quirks of history. From 71 to 75 is a journey downhill all the way. But let's just add, to be fair to her, she was defeated in 77. People thought she was forgotten and written off, and she bounced back in 80.
That's true.
She was, at the end of the day, a remarkable woman.
She was. I think what the saving grace was a decision to hold free and fair elections again after the emergency.
And some people say that she held those elections in 77 knowing she'd lose. And some even say she wanted to lose. It was her way of expiation. We don't know the truth. This is all speculation. But the truth is she held elections when she didn't need to. They were a year ahead of time. She lost. 3 years later, she was back in power with another 2/3 majority.
Right. But my book is not about India's domestic politics.
No, your book is entirely about 71.
The overplay,
and I'll hold it up once again because I think it's a remarkable book, and I think that subtitle is perfectly accurate. This is the definitive story.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Dasgupta, thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much for having me here.